Thank you very much. It is wonderful to see faces out here tonight. This is very exciting. So, the seed for this project was planted several years ago when I had my first real exposure to Russian art song. I was halfway through a doctorate and was, of course, familiar with some instrumental works by Shostakovich and Prokofiev, and could name a couple operas by Mussorgsky and Rimsky-Korsakov, but was still largely ignorant to the vast canon of Russian art songs beyond a few pieces by Rachmaninoff or Tchaikovsky. When beginning the preliminary research for what became my doctoral dissertation, I remember my distinct pleasure in discovering works by Anton Rubinstein, Karl Davidov, and many other names that had previously been absent from my education. Russian art song repertoire is largely ignored in many American song literature courses and applied studios. But, hello, I do need light, however, to read. So if we could get something, that would be great. Thank you, that's great. All right, so I'll start over here. Russian song repertoire is largely ignored in many American song literature courses and applied studios, but I was further perplexed by the composers who also seemed largely ignored by their Russian colleagues and brethren. In my song literature class last year here at Northeastern Illinois University, we had several impassioned discussions about gatekeepers, privilege, and why some composers fail to find their way into the canon. To investigate these questions, and prepare for what I thought would be just a couple months in pandemic lockdown, I ordered a few books. Reading about the contentious relationship between Anton Rubinstein's Russian Music Society and the Moguchoye Kuchka, also known as the Mighty Handful, and their free music school, I came across letters, treatises, and other literature echoing sentiments of patriotism, nationalism, anti-Semitism, and essentially cancel culture, not too different from what we are hearing from some groups in the States today. The topic of nationalism in Russian music is vast, arduous, and highly controversial, so we can really only scratch the surface in our hour or so here today. In order to keep things light, we'll stick to the few composers I am deeming condemned cosmopolitans, whose careers flourished during the mid-19th century, and we'll save for another day, November 4th, I'll see you all back here November 4th, our discussion on the special brand of nationalism that sprouted in the 20th century with the onset of the Bolshevik Revolution and the leadership of Lenin and Stalin. To understand why some composers were scorned for their cosmopolitan appeal, one has to understand the prominent role that European composers played in the Russian court and public eye during the reigns of Peter the Great, Empress Elizabeth, Catherine the Great, and Nicholas I. Marina Frolova-Walker states in her book, Russian Music and Nationalism, that Peter the Great was, in a sense, the catalyst for the birth of Russia's nationalism, for it was he who brought Russia to an uneasy awareness of the early modern Western developments. In doing so, he created the prerequisites for the emergence of national consciousness and a sense of distinctness from Europe. It was later during Elizabeth's reign that Italian opera initially took hold in Russian ears and hearts. Then Russia's westernization and cultural expansion sharpened as Catherine's reign fostered an intense love for all things French. And finally, under the reign of Nicholas I, Italian opera reached its Russian zenith. It was, in fact, due to Tsar Nicholas's rigorous imperial theater dictate that so many Russian composers were brought to a level of frustration over their otherness and developed an inferiority complex. As Helmer states in Not Russian Enough, only on a few occasions did a composer of Russian birth succeed in having his work performed by the permanent Italian opera troupe established in 1843. And after 1849, it was even officially prohibited. Composers were thus denied access to the most prestigious stage and some of the most accomplished performers in the country, fueling nationalist sentiments. With the constant flux of and access to European composers in residence during the 100 or so year period spanning Elizabeth's to Nicholas's reigns, the quote-unquote Russian music, and for our purposes today, Russian vocal music, that sprang forth featured strong elements of Italian and French compositional styles. Initially, the premier composers of Russian songs were in essence foreign musicians hired to serve the Russian court. Predictably, these composers were intrigued by the exotic qualities of Russian folk songs and began to incorporate these characteristics within standardized Western European models. As they grew in popularity, these songs were played not only in the salons of the burgeoning middle class, but also were featured in the concert halls of the elites. The monarchy and elite class never truly abandoned traditional Russian values or forgot their precious folk tales, but as they scrambled to keep up with the latest European and cultural trends, opposing sentiments brewed in the remaining echelons of the nation's people. The intellectual class's interest in Russian heritage and folklore could hardly lessen the yawning gap between the French-speaking European-educated nobility and the largely illiterate peasantry. They were indeed two distinct nations. Ultimately, it was the War of 1812 that began to unify the country under nationalist sentiments, and the development of narodnost occurred. So the term has evolved and shifted application throughout history, especially during the Stalinist regime, but it initially referred to Russia's version of nationalism, promoting the celebration and appreciation of Russian culture and history, as well as Russian cultural identity and unity. The mid-19th century also saw the appearance of a nationalist group known as Slavophiles, whose philosophies and influence could be found throughout Russia, but were most importantly featured in local and regional publications. The Slavophiles directed most of their intellectual energies in two directions. Negatively, they sought to protest against progressive absorption of Western culture. Positively, they sought to formulate an identity and peculiar role for Russia. They were the progenitors of Russia's cancel culture, rejecting European values and practices. Major influencers of the Slavophile movement included philosopher and writer Vladimir Odoyevsky, critic Vladimir Stazov, critic and composer Cesar Cui, as well as Mili Balakirev, composer and leader of the Mighty Handful, aka Moguchoye Kuchka. What we now think of as Russian music is based on the Kuchka legacy and defined the Russian style for wider audiences. There we go. Like their European predecessors, who merely sampled local color, the Kuchka firmly believed that the answer to developing a Russian sound lie within folk song traditions aimed at highlighting the romantic image of a suffering peasant, stoic survivor of harsh landscapes, subject to no bourgeois vices, always thinking anti-European, anti-luxury, anti-elitism. Though the mighty Moguchoye Kuchka were steadfast in their methods and prolific in publication, they found limited success abroad. Not only was the Russian language barrier problematic for many audiences, but the diatonically disparate harmonic vocabulary and unpredictable rhythm shifts were difficult for some listeners to follow. Furthermore, the composers were dissatisfied with their slightly less than rock star status in their native Russia. Helmers explains this by identifying a double standard that critics like Stazov, Cui, and Alexander Sierov duplicitously perpetuated. Russian composers were to write music with a Russian sound, while there were no such restrictions for foreign composers. Hence, the works of native and foreign composers would be judged by different criteria, and the latter would tend to have the upper hand. I would also like to pair this quote with one from Frolova Walker's book that dramatically clarifies the animus relationship between the Moguchoye Kuchka and the tastes of the Russian nobility under Tsar Nicholas I. As she states, the Kuchka had viewed the demonic tunefulness of Italian opera as the most formidable obstacle to the establishment of a Russian national opera. And the Russian public had made its preference for the Italian product all too clear. As you may have guessed, against all odds, the music of the Mighty Handful, mainly Mussorgsky and Rimsky-Korsakov, prevailed and set the standard for what we have come to expect from Russian music today. But what exactly is Russian music? how do we define it? In pursuit of defining Russia's national school, many musicologists have clumsily approached the repertoire through a lens of exoticism or fetishization, insisting on otherness and uniqueness, passing over similarities, and distorting to the point of oversimplification. These early Western scholars were not completely at fault, since many critics and composers in the Slavophile camp worked diligently to promote the otherness as an authentic expression of anything not European. Though they firmly embraced folk traditions and based a large portion of their principles on nuances of the Russian language, there were also some arguably derivative practices, including a harmonic language loosely based around Orientalism, which was a fast and easy way to portray a distinct, non-European character. For our purposes today, I would like to avoid any attempts to specifically define Russian music, as scholar Richard Tereskin has already done so in his 600-page tome, Defining Russia Musically. Instead, I'd like to share with you a list of recurring quotes, themes, and characteristics that I've come across in the literature. One of César Cuy's most popular statements, pulled to exhibit the Kuchka's stance on the three elements of music, places a premium on harmony. A musical idea consists of melody, harmony, and rhythm. Of these three elements, the most important is harmony because of its rich variety and the profound impression it makes on the listener. In melody, there can be no great variety. Salvation must be sought in harmony and in working it out, i.e. the gradual development of musical ideas. It is precisely these last-named elements that the Italians have failed to cultivate at all. Their harmony hardly goes beyond those chords that any amateur might pick out at the piano or guitar. Sick burn, César. Rimsky-Korsakov provided more detailed insight in a letter from 1894 describing Balakiev's insistence on the use of epic parallel seconds, tritones, and juxtaposition of keys and augmented fourths, in addition to parallel fifths, even when they are completely undesirable and serve no artistic purpose. Other quintessential ingredients include the use of a flat sixth, a rising sixth, avoidance of the dominant harmony, and of course, modality. Many authors also recognize the frequent use of what has been deemed the Kuchka pattern, which is a melodic pattern found in the scale degrees, right? So for those of you who are not musicians, these 5, 6 refer to the 5th and 6th scale degrees when you think of a major scale. So that's moving from the 5th, sharp 5th, 6th, flat 6, 5, generally found in an inner voice. In his Evolution of Russian Harmony, Gerald Abraham describes this pattern as, quote, one of the most commonest characteristics of 19th century Russian harmony. One finds it on page after page of any Russian nationalist score and on a good many of Tchaikovsky's. As I mentioned earlier, the Kuchkists also insisted on strong connections to folk song traditions, which led to elements that Odoyevsky defined in 1863. Most important were the absence of melodic leaps larger than a fifth, avoiding the dominant seventh chord, an observance of diatonicism that was as strict as possible, and he entreated composers to avoid a correct or perfect cadence. The Kuchka school emerged in an attempt to cancel European elitism and to thwart attempts at formalized education that would impose any restrictions on the authenticity of expression by native Russian composers. As you can see, however, they merely created their own set of exclusive conditions that limited a number of composers and developed little beyond the cultivation of a local color. Inconceivably, the ingredients used to portray the musical characteristics of Russian local color and folk elements are the same as those used by Beethoven, Liszt, Chopin, Dvorak, Turina, and even Crawford Seeger. These included the use of drones or pedal points, modal melodies, and avoidance of full cadences. As Karl Dahlhaus concludes, the answer to questions of authenticity and nationality in music cannot be resolved on the basis of its melodic, harmonic, or rhythmic substance, but rather depends on some consensus by its recipients. The composer for which the world and history have come to a consensus on this one question is one Mikhail Glinka, the father of Russian music, as he is called. Balakirev and his cohort built their principles off the works of Glinka, and Odoyevsky viewed Glinka as an injection of young, healthy blood into a decrepit European music culture. Glinka's role in the development of a Russian national style was so imperative to Balakirev that he worked diligently to inflate their relationship, promoting himself as a second Glinka and the heir to Glinka's legacy. For many, Glinka's legitimacy came from his connection to and incorporation of folk elements. As David Brown describes it, what Glinka did was to draw upon characteristics of all the varieties of indigenous Russian music as he heard from his earliest years, not with the condescension of the sophisticate who wants to be folksy, but with the perfectly natural ease of a musician for whom folk song was as deeply rooted, as valid an experience as more cultivated music. This quote and similar sentiments found throughout the literature have always perplexed me because I never found Glinka's art songs to be specifically Russian sounding or even particularly exotic for that matter. Hence, it makes perfect sense to me when Marina Frolova-Walker states that throughout his career, Glinka barely advanced beyond Beethoven as a scholar of peasant music, native to his land. More exigent than his folk connections were Glinka's technical virtuosity and enthusiastic support from international audiences. It is ironic that Glinka is hailed as the father of Russian music and depicted as a repudiator of European styles when it was, in fact, his European education and compositional techniques that appealed to a wider audience. Glinka's compositional phases correspond with his trips abroad, and you can hear influences of mazurkas, boleros, barcarolles in his vocal music, featuring easy and flexible melodies. His regard for authentic declamation did garner the attention of locals and Slavophiles, but it was his Italianate melodic writing that elevated his currency abroad. Taruskin notes, after his early desultory lessons with the younger Zamboni, Glinka went on a pilgrimage to Milan in the early 1830s to continue his studies. There he became acquainted with Bellini and Donizetti and wrote several credible imitations of their work, which you will hear in a few minutes. So on this slide, I have cropped and pasted 3 accompaniments. One is by Glinka, and the other 2 are by Donizetti and Bellini, 2 of the most famous Italian bel canto composers. At first glance, there's very little that sets these apart, suggesting that Glinka was working to master the Italian style. So for those of you who can read music, you can see that the left hand features a very slow-moving bass line, and then we have arpeggiation of broken chords in the right hand going up and down. All very similar. So on the next slide, take a second for yourself and see if you can decipher which of the accompaniments are by the Italian composers and which belongs to Glinka. So it's a trick question. They're all by Glinka. The bottom section belongs to the first piece that you'll hear today, to the zither. In Glinka's vocal music, listen for ternary form, sections defined by shifts in minor and major modes, and accompaniment textures that are transparent but supportive. And so at this time, I'm going to invite up Dr. Kim, and we're going to begin the musical portion. It may seem odd to have begun the musical portion of this presentation with works by Glinka acknowledging his influence on the nationalist Russian school and his status as the father of Russian music. However, I brought him into the argument to illustrate the major cosmopolitan influences on which the new Russian school was based. For much of his career, Glinka composed with a nationalist consciousness. However, it obviously did not yield the same results as those exhibited by Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, and the rest of the Kuchka. Furthermore, toward the end of his life, he expressed a genuine exhaustion at the prospect of composing in the service of a nation. In 1855, he stated, "Even if my muse were to suddenly awaken, I should rather write something that textless for orchestra. I'm rejecting Russian music as well as the Russian winter. I don't want any more Russian drama. It has given me enough bother." Though Glinka rejected Russian sensibilities, he was never forgotten by his successors, and his cosmopolitan practices were never really acknowledged or addressed, let alone condemned. Anton Rubinstein, on the other hand, faced harsh and persistent criticism throughout his life for efforts to cultivate Russian music and expand its international appeal. He was the leader of the conservative movement in Russia in the mid-19th century, and his music is characteristically of a Western European and lyrical quality. Finn Dyson describes it as reminding one of Schubert with his cheerfulness and enthusiasm, but he more often resembles Mendelssohn, refined and melancholy, but sometimes even monotonous and boring. Rubinstein garnered an international reputation at a very young age, as he was a piano prodigy, and much of his childhood was spent concertizing with his brother throughout Western Europe. It was during this time that he received composition and theory lessons and later became acquainted with Chopin, Liszt, and Felix Mendelssohn, and Meyerbeer. The Slavophiles and the Kuchka faction had ample complaints against Rubinstein and his music, but his critics often cited his disregard for poetry and language. As a lover of classical instrumental music, Rubinstein strove to impart on his vocal music square and symmetrical forms, usually at the cost of the poetry and language. As a lover of other criticisms were subtler and illustrate the negative effects of anti-Semitic bias that remained ever present in Russia. It is certainly possible that Rubinstein was rejected by his contemporaries due to purely philosophical and musical opposition. Possible, but not likely. Contemporary composer and critic Alexander Sierov, who was also Jewish, and in private conversation attributed his own musical abilities to his heritage, but expressed quite the opposite in his public life. In his writing, the composer-critic frequently expressed himself in overtly anti-Semitic terms and penned the most profoundly anti-Semitic sallies against Rubinstein in the contemporary press. Despite his prolific output, Rubinstein's greatest legacy in the Russian musical community is actually the Russian Musical Society. This institution allowed for droves of native composers and musicians to perform at high enough levels to attain international regard. Furthermore, enthusiasm for the Russian Musical Society eventually led to the establishment of the St. Petersburg and Moscow conservatories. Rubinstein's adversaries found it reprehensible that he would make any effort to dispatch his philosophies and practices to any other Russian composer and essentially poison their native gifts. Sazov, who advocated autodidacticism in opposition to Rubinstein's conservatory in the 1860s, continued to claim that all of the best Russian musicians were skeptical of book learning, and this saved the composers of the new Russian school from writing pedantic or routine works. In response, Balakirev founded the free music school that was cheaper than the Rubinstein establishments and made no attempt to contaminate Russian composers' natural gifts with Western European rules and sonorities. So, Taruskin identifies the unfortunate truth that, for a while, both sides of the conservatory controversy would claim to be motivated by patriotism and national pride. Only one side was racist, and this too is unfortunately a large part of what motivated musical nationalism in Russia. Both sides wanted to see Russian music flourish and develop, but it was the nationalists that saw education as elitism, a sign of inauthenticity, and thereby not patriotic. So we are going to give Anton Rubinstein his due today, and you're going to hear a few pieces by him as well.
Thank you.
Very little research has been dedicated to the life of Karl Davidov, despite the fact that he was a well-renowned conductor, composer, and cellist. Like Rubinstein, he was Jewish and part of the conservative movement in Russia. He became professor of cello at the St. Petersburg Conservatory in 1863, and he was the conservatory's director from 1878 until 1886. He is mostly remembered for his violoncello compositions, but also wrote 25 songs for voice. His vocal works contain an innate beauty characterized by vaulted melodies with large intervallic leaps, and harmonic restlessness with incessant modulations and chromatic turns. What is unfortunate about his music is his frequent disregard for poetry, ignoring form and word stress. His romances are characterized by beautiful cello-like melodies constructed with zero regard for the text being set. Unfortunately, sheet music for his solo voice compositions is rare in the United States. So two of the pieces that you're actually going to hear today, the second two, came to me sort of kismet, where I've had the sheet music for the first piece for quite a long time and could not find the last two selections from this opus. And so by chance, I Facebook messaged an expat American who is living in Russia and who is a singer. And I just said, hey, we don't know each other, but we have these mutual friends, and I'm really looking for the sheet music. If you happen to find it in a store, I will pay you handsome sums of money. I really need to have this music. And a couple days later, he messaged me back and said, oh my God, you will never guess what I just found. So because Karl Davidov worked, was a critical character in the growth of the St. Petersburg Conservatory, some of his music is kept in a closet in a museum over there. And so there was a leak and they had to clean out the closet. And so all the things that were in the closet were moved to the basement of the St. Petersburg Conservatory Library, where this gentleman, it was his job to work there, and he was cleaning out stuff in the basement, and he opened a box and went, oh my God. And so he, texted me and he sent me the music. And so it was really kind of this amazing experience. And so I just want to encourage everybody, reach out to your friends. You will never know who's going to help you find that jewel that you've been looking for.
Of
The last composer featured today may seem a little out of place, since Rimsky-Korsakov was the youngest member of the Moguchoya Kuchka. His sense of harmony was the most advanced and played a key role in developing a national sound, but his music also bears the influence of Berlioz, Respighi, Debussy, and Liszt. Moreover, as Rimsky-Korsakov settled in his own compositional style, his dissatisfaction with the Kuchkist realism and contemporary developments in the West made him turn to tradition. Following his rediscovery of Mozart and Italian opera, Rimsky-Korsakov attempted to redefine the Kuchkist notions of what constituted a Russian national opera in his Tsar's Bride. He had grown weary with what he considered realist decadence, exhibiting fragmented melodies and overindulgent dissonances. Critics and audiences alike noted the opera's return to old forms and reliance on simplicity. Rimsky-Korsakov commented on this, espousing, "Not only is there no harm in becoming more simple, more natural and broader, it is necessary, not just for me, but for everyone." Most of Rimsky-Korsakov's art songs embody a natural sense of form, often derived from the poems he set, though he favored classical forms. His romances tend to be short but detailed masterpieces incorporating a wealth of color and themes. 3 pieces that close today's program are from sets written around the years just preceding the completion of The Tsar's Bride. It was during this period that he exchanged the harmonic cacophony of the kuchka for transparent voice leading, overtly Italianate vocal lines, and rounded forms. say thank you again for everybody for coming out tonight. It is really wonderful to see faces in the audience. And I want to dedicate this last selection to a gentleman, Gennady Petersen, who succumbed to pancreatic cancer this past summer. He was instrumental in introducing me to Russian art song. He runs the Russian opera program at AVA, where that's the first time I ever sang Russian music, and he was just such a wonderful person who gave so much of himself constantly, and so he was a bright light that we lost this year, among many.